Welcome in, everyone. I'm so glad you were joining us today.
Yeah, it is great to be here.
Because you are the kind of listener who really goes beyond those surface-level dates and broad summaries.
Right, you look for those granular, high-stakes moments.
Exactly. The moments that redefine eras. And today we have a really remarkable piece of history to explore. We are pulling out the microscope on some excerpts from Wikipedia detailing a papal brief,
Yeah, it is known as quam memoranda.
which, for those of us who do not spend our weekends reading 19th century Latin documents, that translates to on that memorable day.
A very fitting title for what we are about to cover.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack an incredibly rapid and intense political collision.
Ideological, too, between Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and Pope Pius VII.
Right. We will be tracing a timeline that includes territorial annexation, the deployment of ultimate spiritual weapons, and a midnight military raid on a palace.
It is a wild sequence of events.
But before we jump into that timeline, I want to establish a really clear boundary for our discussion today.
Yeah, that is important to do up front.
The historical text we are analyzing covers a period of intense religious and political conflict between the French Empire and the Holy See. We are absolutely not taking any sides here.
Not at all.
Our goal is simply to impartially examine the events, the specific language used in the documents, and the strategic maneuvers of both parties as captured in our source material.
Just looking at the facts and perspectives from the text.
Exactly. So to set the stage, consider the geopolitical reality of Europe in the early 19th century. The French military machine is redrawing the map of the continent.
Right, they're everywhere.
Now imagine you are sitting in the Vatican. You are the sovereign pontiff, and you're watching the most formidable military commander of the age systematically consolidate power.
And then that same commander publicly declares that your authority is a threat.
A fundamental threat to the stability of his empire.
Right,
You
yeah.
do. The pressure is immense, the threat is immediate, and your options are incredibly limited. Okay, let's unpack this.
So the timeline of this escalation moves with an almost mechanical speed.
Very bureaucratic, right?
Exactly. According to the source, the physical pressure begins in earnest in February of 1808.
When the French troops cross into the Papal States.
Yes, they officially occupy Rome, and then that is followed by the region of Marseille,
So the French military is essentially swallowing the geography surrounding the Vatican,
leaving the Pope as an occupied leader in his own capital.
which is just a crazy situation to be in.
And Napoleon formalizes this reality very shortly after. By April of 1808, he issues a decree announcing the annexation of the church states directly into the French Empire.
But he leaves a little caveat at first, right?
Right, at this initial stage, Napoleon includes a caveat, allowing the Pope to retain his power strictly within the city limits of Rome,
So it's a calculated move to absorb the surrounding territory, but
trying to avoid a total decapitation of the local government.
yeah, but that uneasy status quo only lasts about a year.
Before the tension just entirely fractures, we arrive at May 1809, which is when Napoleon publishes two new decrees.
And the language he uses in these documents is incredibly revealing.
It really is. He proclaims that the temporal pretensions of the Pope were irreconcilable with the safety, tranquility, and prosperity of the empire.
The tempered pretensions.
What's fascinating here is Napoleon's surgical use of that phrase, temporal pretensions. This cuts to the very core of the 19th century papacy.
Because we often think of the Pope purely as a spiritual leader.
Right, but at this time, the Pope was also a temporal monarch. He had secular authority over the Papal States.
Meaning he collected taxes, maintained borders, commanded a civic administration.
Exactly, and Napoleon is systematically decoupling those two roles. He is arguing that the physical governance of land by the church is a geopolitical threat to France.
So therefore he is simply absorbing the land to ensure his empire's safety.
And the French authorities do not just publish this decree in Paris.
No, they bring it straight to the Pope's doorstep. On June 10th, 1809, they officially proclaim this annexation right in the streets of Rome,
They are effectively announcing the end of the secular power of the Holy See.
which of course forces a major crisis of leadership for Pius VII.
The text notes that the Pope initially hesitates here.
Which makes sense. You are facing down the full weight of the French military occupation.
Any retaliation carries the risk of physical violence or the complete destruction of the church's infrastructure in Italy.
But the source mentions his advisor, Cardinal Paca, steps in during this moment of hesitation.
Yeah, Paca insists that the church cannot let this decree pass without a formal, forceful response.
And that insistence really acts as the catalyst for one of the swiftest bureaucratic retaliations in history.
It is amazing. Later that very same day, June 10th, 1809, Pius VII finalizes and releases the papal bull Quam Memoranda.
The turnaround time is just staggering to me. The French proclaim the end of his secular rule in the morning.
And by the afternoon, the Pope has drafted a sweeping decree of excommunication.
And the rhetoric in the excerpt is completely uncompromising.
The opening sentiment really sets the tone for the entire document. Quote, "The time for clemency is over." Yeah, Pius VII lays out a very specific historical and moral justification for his actions.
He points to previous sovereign pontiffs, right?
He does, noting that popes renowned for their holiness and learning had in the past deployed extreme measures against rebellious kings for committing just one or two crimes.
So he is building a legal and historical precedent, arguing that if his predecessors brought the hammer down over isolated incidents, he has a much larger mandate to act now.
He explicitly states this. He writes that he cannot show fear or remain passive after witnessing, quote, "so many evil deeds and sacrileges so heinous and so universally known."
He actually frames his rapid response as a defense against
potential criticism, right?
Yeah, stating he fears being accused of weakness and procrastination far more than being accused of rashness.
Because to his mind, the French occupation is an outrage that actively prevents him from exercising his apostolic ministry.
And when we look at the actual punishment handed down in this document, it is massive in its scope.
But interestingly, the source points out that Napoleon Bonaparte's name is conspicuously absent from the text.
Right, the Pope doesn't formally name the emperor.
Rather than targeting a single individual, the excommunication functions as a dragnet. It applies to anyone who invaded Rome or the ecclesiastical territory.
It specifically calls out the sacrilegious violation of St. Peter's patrimony by French troops.
Yes.
For those of us who aren't steeped in Catholic history,
Yes.
what exactly does St. Peter's patrimony refer to in this context?
It refers to the lands and properties that were historically considered to belong to the Church and trusted to the Pope as the successor of St. Peter.
Ah, okay. So by using that specific term, Pius is elevating the French annexation from a mere political land grab to an act of spiritual theft.
Precisely. He is saying, you aren't just taking my land, you are stealing from the Apostle Peter.
And the penalty for that theft is severe. The bull issues canonical excommunication to all authors, promoters, counselors, or adherents of these acts.
And it strips them of any privileges or indults.
How does an indult factor into this penalty?
An indult is essentially a special permission or privilege granted by the Pope that allows an individual or group to do something contrary to standard canon law.
Oh, I see. So by stripping these away, along with issuing canonical excommunication, the Pope is entirely cutting these individuals off from the spiritual life sacraments and legal protections of the Church.
It is the absolute maximum penalty he can levy.
The logistics of how this penalty was delivered are genuinely remarkable, too. The bull was finalized on June 10th.
And by the very next morning, June 11, paper copies of this massive excommunication decree were physically plastered across the walls of Rome's three major churches:
St. Mary Major St. John Lateran and St. Peter's Basilica.
The operational efficiency required to pull that off in a city heavily occupied by hostile foreign troops is astounding.
They had to print these documents in secret
And have operatives moving through the streets in the dead of night to paste them onto the most prominent public buildings in the city.
Imagine the psychological impact on a French soldier occupying Rome. You wake up, you walk out to patrol the streets, and see a document hanging on St. Peter's Basilica explicitly stating that by participating in this occupation, you are cut off from the grace of God.
It is an incredibly potent use of asymmetrical warfare.
The French have the cannons, but the Pope has the spiritual authority. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, definitely.
The French military authorities are suddenly faced with an occupied city that has just been handed a spiritual mandate to resist.
They realized pretty quickly that allowing the Pope to remain in Rome serving as a beacon of defiance and excommunicating their forces is a completely untenable situation.
And the internal communications among the French command really illustrate the friction of this moment.
Yes, General Sextius Alexandre François de Mioli, who commands the French garrison in Rome, is initially hesitant to take direct physical action against the Pope.
Which makes sense. Arresting the leader of the Catholic Church is a logistical and public relations nightmare.
But he is pushed by his subordinate Brigadier General Etienne Radet.
Radet argues the reality of their situation right.
He argues that Rome cannot be governed and the occupation cannot be maintained without a definitive show of force.
And Radet's argument ultimately wins out. General de Miollis authorizes the operation to remove the Pope.
This raises an important question. When an empire built on military might encounters an opponent whose only weapon is ideological, how does it respond?
That is a great point.
Radet's argument highlights the limitation of military logic. The French troops couldn't shoot a papal bull. They couldn't put an excommunication in a prison cell.
So the only countermeasure they had available was to physically neutralize the author of the ideas.
They had to translate a spiritual conflict into a physical one.
And that translation happens violently in the early hours of July 6, 1809.
It has been less than a month since the excommunication was posted.
Brigadier General Radet and a contingent of troops breach the Quirinal Palace under the cover of darkness.
They confront Pope Pius VII, place him under arrest, force him into a carriage, and smuggle him out of Rome before the city can even react.
Just a literal kidnapping of a pope.
Yes, and the removal of the pope triggers a prolonged and highly unusual exile.
The source traces his route northward from Rome to Genoa,
Then across the Alps to Grenoble in France.
before the authorities finally settle him in a large house in the coastal town of Savona.
And the details of his confinement in Savona highlight a bizarre contradiction in French policy.
He is undeniably a political prisoner.
He was kidnapped in the night and transported across borders against his will.
Yet the text points out that during his time in Savona, the French authorities allowed him to continue conducting religious ceremonies.
They even permitted the local population to visit him.
Why would they do that?
That contradiction exposes the tightrope Napoleon was trying to walk. He needed to physically remove Pius from Rome to dismantle the Pope's temporal authority and secure the Italian territories.
But he couldn't just completely silence him.
Right, Napoleon was acutely aware that completely silencing the Pope's spiritual function could ignite massive uprisings among the millions of Catholics living within the French Empire.
Napoleon wanted a neutralized monarch, but he was terrified of creating a religious martyr.
So he creates this strange scenario where the Pope is a captive but still permitted to function as a priest to the local townspeople.
It is a high-stakes standoff that leaves both men in incredibly precarious positions. You have an emperor trying to manage an imprisoned spiritual leader, and a pope trying to maintain his authority while completely stripped of his physical independence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the true historical weight of this event isn't just in the kidnapping or the decrees.
No, it is found in how this relationship ultimately resolves years later.
After the geopolitical landscape of Europe has been entirely upended.
So we have to jump forward in the timeline to see that resolution. The French Empire eventually collapses under the weight of its own expansion and external coalitions.
Napoleon is defeated, stripped of his power, and sent into his own forced exile on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic.
The man who previously dictated the borders of Europe and ordered the absorption of the Papal States is now isolated on a rock in the ocean.
And it is in this isolation that we see a profound shift in his perspective regarding Pius VII.
The source provides documentation of Napoleon's conversations with General Montholon during his time on St. Helena.
When discussing the Pope, Napoleon's language is completely transformed. There is no mention of temporal pretensions or threats to the empire.
Instead, Napoleon refers to the Pope as an old man full of tolerance and light.
It is a stark departure from the bureaucratic hostility of 1809.
And he goes further than just offering a compliment. Napoleon actually expresses remorse for the events that transpired.
He tells Montholon, quote, "Fatal circumstances embroiled our cabinets. I regret it exceedingly."
The former emperor is openly lamenting the political machinations that led to the clash and the kidnapping.
And this introspection leads to a highly significant request. Napoleon, facing his own mortality and reflecting on his life, asks for a Catholic chaplain to be sent to St. Helena.
According to the text, his justification for this request was simple. He said, "It would rest my soul to hear Mass."
To understand the weight of that request, we have to look at who is receiving it.
Right. The petition to send a chaplain eventually makes its way to Pope Pius VII.
The very man who was dragged out of his palace in the middle of the night by Napoleon's soldiers
He's now being asked to provide spiritual comfort to his former captor.
From an impartial historical perspective, the Pope's response is a masterclass in separating personal grievance from institutional duty.
Pius does not ignore the request or use it as an opportunity for retaliation.
Instead, he actively petitions the British government, who are the ones holding Napoleon captive, to grant the request and allow a priest to travel to St. Helena.
He leverages his diplomatic channels to advocate for the man who dismantled his country.
He does. And the petition is successful. Pope Pius sends the Abbé Vignali to the South Atlantic to serve as Napoleon's personal chaplain.
That is incredible.
This act operates on two levels. Diplomatically, it demonstrates the magnanimity and enduring stability of the Church in contrast to the fallen French Empire.
And spiritually.
Spiritually, it aligns with the Pope's mandate to provide the sacraments to any Catholic who seeks them, regardless of their past actions.
Because of that decision, the narrative concludes in a remarkably quiet, reconciled manner. Napoleon Bonaparte passes away on May 5, 1821, at Longwood House.
In his final days, he received the Eucharist and the last rites from the chaplain the Pope had sent.
The excommunication that had been pasted onto the walls of St. Peter's 12 years prior was effectively lifted, and he died reconciled with the Church. So what does this all mean?
When we synthesize these sources, we see a textbook case study on the collision of different types of authority.
You have the ultimate secular military machine attempting to forcibly absorb an ancient ideology-based institution.
We see how quickly bureaucratic disagreements escalate into midnight raids and excommunications. But more importantly, the aftermath shows how transient physical power can be.
The empire that seemed invincible completely dissolved.
While the ideological institution it tried to suppress ended up providing the final comforts to the fallen emperor.
That is exactly why we do these deep dives. It is easy for you, the listener, to see a passing reference to the Napoleonic Wars and assume it is just a list of troop movements and treaties.
But when we actually unpack the original texts and the quotes, we uncover these intense human dramas.
We find moments of bureaucratic calculation, midnight desperation, and surprising reconciliations that reshape how we understand these historical figures.
It really changes the whole perspective.
It does. As we wrap up today's exploration of Quam Memoranda, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that looks at the unintended consequences of Napoleon's actions.
Okay.
Napoleon invaded Rome and kidnapped the Pope because he believed that the Pope's temporal power, his control over physical land and government, was a threat. Napoleon thought that by stripping the papacy of its country, he was weakening it.
Right, that was the whole goal.
But consider the long-term historical irony. By destroying the Pope's geographic kingdom, Napoleon arguably modernized the Vatican. By forcibly removing the burden of running a conventional nation-state, fighting border wars, and collecting civic taxes, Napoleon inadvertently helped transform the papacy into a purely global, moral, and spiritual authority.
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
It makes you wonder if, in his attempt to neutralize the Pope's power in 1809, Napoleon actually paved the way for the Church to become far more influential in the centuries that followed than it ever could have been while clinging to a small patch of land in Italy.
Something to think about, for sure.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this custom-tailored deep dive. We always appreciate exploring these dense, fascinating historical narratives with you, and we look forward to uncovering the next great story together.